address its status as a tax haven wonderland. It has failed in its
Nays are 129 and the bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. And the unfinished business is the vote on passage of H.R. 3080, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 158, H.R. 3080, a bill to implement the United States-Korea Free Trade Agreement.
The question is on passage of the bill. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
The House passes the Panama Free Trade Bill by a vote of 300 to 129. The Colombia Free Trade Agreement passed by a vote of 262 to 167. And this is a vote on the Korea Free Trade Bill. It is a 5-minute vote, and 2 more 5-minute votes will follow this. Passage of this bill this afternoon ahead of the visit tomorrow by the Korean President Lee Myung-bak. President Lee will come to the White House early tomorrow and also come to the Congress tomorrow afternoon. Speaking to a joint meeting late tomorrow afternoon, we'll have live coverage of that here on C-SPAN. As this vote on the Korea Free Trade Agreement continues, we're going to show you some of the debate on the bill from earlier today.
I rise in support of all 3 of these very important agreements because they promote U.S. engagement in strategically important countries around the world. Also, they promote U.S. leadership. They open new markets for farmers, American farmers, ranchers, and businesses. This means American jobs, good-paying American jobs. These agreements constitute a signature jobs bill, a jobs promotion bill. South Korea is a critical U.S. ally in Asia and one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Multiple agreements have occurred throughout Asia over the past few years while America has sat on the sidelines. This agreement is the largest free trade agreement for the U.S. and could result in an increase of our exports by $9.7 billion, according to the International Trade Commission, by lowering tariffs and other barriers to U.S. goods and services. We must pass this agreement in order to gain leverage in Asia and to show support for one of our key allies in Asia. This expansion of U.S. engagement will serve as a platform to build further commercial relationships, creating more jobs for American workers by opening new markets. Upon implementation, more than 1/3 of Louisiana's exports will be duty-free, and that's just a starting point. This alone will give Louisiana companies a significant advantage over similar products made in countries that don't have an FTA with South Korea. We know small and medium-sized businesses are the key to creating new jobs. Over 18,500 companies of this size, small and medium companies, export to South Korea. And they will be able to grow and hire new workers here in the United States, right here at home. These agreements are about creating jobs. In fact, President Obama's estimates that the passage of these bills will create over 250,000 new jobs right here at home as a starting point. Madam Speaker, I urge voting to promote all of these agreements because it will promote American competitiveness and American jobs. It will promote American credibility with our trading allies. It will promote American confidence in our international engagement. It will promote American leverage as we work with our trading partners. And most importantly, it will promote American leadership in the 21st century. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan. Mr.
You have 3 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, ranking on trade, Mr. McDermott.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the Korean Free Trade Agreement. We should all be proud of Korea. We created Korea. Our troops went to Korea at the beginning of the Korean War and saved South Korea from becoming North Korea. That's how the Koreans look at it. I took a trip with the Commerce Secretary, Gary Locke, who's now the ambassador to China. And the Koreans said, we're very grateful and we want to have this relationship with you. And they have come because we opened our markets to them. They are the most successful country in Asia in coming from nowhere to an average income of around $33,000 per person. Now, making an agreement with them is making an agreement more with an equal. And when we went to, from Seattle, we know about our regional relationship with them. We are the third largest state exporter to Korea. In 2010, Washington State exported more than $55 billion worth of goods, more than half of all that went to Asia. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in my state depend on this trade relationship. So this is not something where we're going to lose jobs. I believe it's important to move ahead because I think it's equally important to move ahead right. And what is amazing is how the Bush administration went into this thing and never figured out the biggest problem, that it was a one-way trading operation. We said to them, send us anything you want, and they did. And now we were going to go for an agreement where we were going to turn it around and say, we're going to send some things to you. The Bush administration ignored that. Had it not been for Charlie Rangel and Sandy Levin and the Democrats, we would never have gotten them to sit down and renegotiate. They didn't want to reopen. They had actually passed it and felt badly and kind of, they lost some face because we didn't respond. But we said, no, it's not good enough. So we brought this agreement back and got an agreement that is much fairer and much more equitably deals.
The yeas are 278 and the nays are 151. The bill is passed. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion to concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 2832, offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2832, an act to extend a generalized system of preferences and for other purposes.
The question is on the motion, and members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote, a 5-minute vote.
The House passes all three free trade agreements, passing the Colombia Bill 262 to 167, the Panama Bill 300 to 129, and moments ago passing the Korea Free Trade Agreement by a vote of 278 to 151. Here they're voting on final passage on extending the Generalized System of Preferences, the largest trade preference program that the U.S. has. It also extends the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which benefits workers whose job has been lost to jobs overseas. This is a 5-minute vote. One more 5-minute vote will follow this on a bill dealing with veterans' benefits. And if you want to weigh in on the conversation and thoughts about the free trade bills, the debate continues, first of all, in the Senate, with votes expected later today. But we've opened up a spot online at our Facebook page, facebook.com/cspan, where you can post your comments. Marcos Mesa says there's no free trade. The U.S. needs to go back to the way it was when everything was made in the USA. Referencing Ross Perot, Don Jones says, love that sucking sound, America. And Joss Caleb Mayorga says, amazing the level of negativity represented by comments. He says there isn't a single solution that can fix all the economic woes of this country. Again, you can feel free to post your comments, facebook.com/cspan. Also, we'll take your calls tomorrow on the free trade bills as we hear from Congressman Charles Bass, Republican of New Hampshire. He joins us tomorrow morning, as well as Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, Democrat from Ohio, both of them on tomorrow morning's Washington Journal, which gets underway at 7 a.m. Eastern.
On this vote, the yeas are 307 and the nays are 122. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The motion is adopted. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2433 as amended, of which the yeas and nays are ordered, and the clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2433, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code to make certain improvements in the laws relating to the employment and training of veterans and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device, and this will be a 5-minute vote.
And this is likely to be the last roll call recorded vote of the day as the House votes on the Veterans Opportunity to Work bill, 5-minute vote, and then they will move on to continue work on a bill that blocks EPA rules on toxic air emissions from industrial boilers and incinerators. Just under 10 amendments remaining on that. But in the votes that just happened, they passed the Colombia Free Trade Bill 262 to 167, the Panama Free Trade Bill 300 to 129, the South Korea Bill 307 to 122, and they renewed the trade preference programs with the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program as well, and that passed by a vote of 307 to 122. Number of members weighing in on that vote at twitter.com/cspan. Under Members of Congress, Mike Ross of Arkansas tweeting, "I just voted for trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea to boost Arkansas exports." Also, Dan Burton of Indiana saying these trade agreements are positive steps toward getting our economy back on track and putting Hoosiers back to work. But Dave McKinley from West Virginia, Republican, says he voted against FTAs. Some Americans may benefit from these trade agreements, but most northern West Virginians not among them. Some of the tweets from members of Congress, which you will find at twitter.com/cspan. But there is work still ahead in the U.S. Senate on the free trade bills. Debate continuing on the floor now. Senator Kirk of Illinois speaking. You can follow that on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Ahead in the U.S. Senate, David Rogers of Politico writes they might see some action tomorrow on 2012 spending. He writes this afternoon that a nearly $182 billion package of long-delayed spending bills will be brought to the Senate floor Thursday in a first test of both parties' commitment to reviving some semblance of the traditional appropriations debate that has all but disappeared in recent years. That from David Rogers reporting for Politico.
On this vote, the yeas are 418 and the nays are 6. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
Madam Speaker,
Ohio rise.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to remove my name as a co-sponsor from H.R. 1380.
Without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table the bill H.R. 2944 with the Senate amendment thereto and concur in the Senate amendment.
The clerk will report the title of the bill and report the Senate amendment.
H.R. 2944, an act to provide for the continued performance of the functions of the United States Parole Commission and for other purposes. Senate amendment.
Is there objection? Without objection, the Senate amendment is concurred in and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate and 11:30 a.m. for legislative business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that my name be removed as a co-prime sponsor of H.R. 822.
Without objection.
Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 2250.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 419 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House of the Committee and the whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 2250. Will the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, kindly take the chair?
The House, in the Committee of the whole House of the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 2250, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide additional time for the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to issue achievable standards for industrial, commercial, and institutional boilers, process heaters, and incinerators, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose on Tuesday, October 11, 2011, the amendment number 3, printed in the Congressional Record by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, has been disposed of. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My amendment's a very simple amendment, should get unanimous support here, and it simply requires the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator to consider increases in illness-related absences from work when establishing a compliance date for the boiler rule. Last week, I offered similar language as an amendment to the Cement Sector Regulatory Relief Act, which unfortunately didn't pass. I don't think it was clearly understood by both sides of the aisle. However, I believe my amendment is more applicable to this legislation since boilers and incinerators pose an even greater health threat to the American people. In fact, EPA's analysis demonstrates that for every year this rule will be in effect, it would prevent up to 320,000 missed work or school days. During the debate on my amendment last week, the majority conceded, which I appreciated, that the amendment would do no harm because the majority thought that the language was already in the bill, that it would be duplicative and unnecessary. The reality is that there's nothing in the underlying legislation that requires the Administrator to consider illness-related absences from work when setting a compliance date. Now, indeed, it should have been in there, and I can understand why the other side thought it would be in there because it should have been in there. But it wasn't in there, and that's why I offered this amendment. That this factor is critical, and that any establishment of a compliance date that does not consider the health of the American workforce is fundamentally flawed and inadequate. As the majority correctly stated last week, the EPA already knows how many workdays will be missed as a result of delaying the boiler rule. So my amendment will not hinder the EPA's decision-making process. Additionally, as the majority admitted last week, at worst, my amendment does no harm, or as kind of the NBA rule, no harm, no foul. However, at best, my amendment ensures that EPA's decision is based on a more complete analysis of the economic impacts of the rule. And given the economic consequences of 320,000 days of missed work or school a year, it's imperative that EPA factor this information into its compliance date decision. I ask the majority to recognize that if the United States is going to retain its status as the world's economic engine, then we need to have the world's healthiest and most productive workforce and children. But will this not happen if we continue to let polluting boilers and incinerators undermine the health and well-being of millions of American workers and children? I encourage my colleagues to understand the importance of a healthy workforce and support my amendment. On behalf of the millions of American workers and school children who have been forced to miss work or school because of sickness incurred by breathing toxic pollutants from boilers and incinerators, mercury no less, which interferes with young people's abilities to think, I ask that you support my amendment. It's time to put partisanship aside, work together to strengthen the American worker and the American school child. I urge passage of my amendment and yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman from Tennessee for offering this amendment, and he always does a great job of articulating his position on these issues, some of which are pretty complicated. And in this amendment, he would add illness-related work absences to the considerations when EPA is setting the compliance deadline. And of course, that's one of the main purposes of H.R. 2250, is to allow additional time for universities, hospitals, industries in complying with these rather complicated boiler MACT rules. And in the legislation, we set out 6 or 7 specific items that EPA must consider in setting the compliance deadline. They do have to set it within no sooner than within 5 years, but the EPA administrator has additional time after that. And the section of the bill that I'm talking about identifies specific issues relevant to a facility's ability to comply, simply ensures that in setting these compliance dates, plant-focused considerations are taken into account. Now, EPA already has the responsibility for considering health impacts in setting its standards. And it's unclear exactly how this amendment would be implemented, different from what the Act already requires EPA to do. So I'm going to respectfully oppose the amendment and ask that it be defeated. However, if we end up having a vote on this, and if it is defeated either by voice vote or by record vote, if we're successful in getting this into a conference with the Senate, I would specifically make a commitment to the gentleman from Tennessee that I would work with him sincerely in trying to address his concern. And I might say that we've had a lot of amendments, and this is, I guess, the only time we said we'd really be willing to do that, but I know you're trying to address an issue that's of concern to you, and while I oppose the amendment here, if we are successful in getting to a conference, I'd look forward to working with the gentleman at that time. And so, for that reason, I would formally, at this time, oppose the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request a vote by the ayes and nays. Roll call.
And the request for a recorded vote?
Yes, that's exactly.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises. State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2250, directs you to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2250 and has come to no resolution thereon. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been appearing on the floor of this House now for quite a while talking about regulations. But information has come to my attention from a report that was prepared by a group of people in the Texas government about problems that are way beyond anything that many people are perceiving concerning what's going on the border between Texas and Mexico and this ongoing immigration crisis that we have in America. And quite honestly, is so concerning that tonight we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about, and I hope we'll be joined by some of my colleagues to talk about the actual crisis that is going on in a criminally, with the criminal element that is gathered across the border from Texas, with the cartels, the drug cartels in Mexico. I'm going to have some posters here in a few minutes to talk about some of these things, but I think that everybody is well aware of the fact that we have an issue that is going to have to be addressed by this Congress, and that issue is not only the legal immigration needs to be worked on and fixed so that we can have an immigration policy that actually works in this country rather than one that seems to be haphazard and in many ways subject to the whims of people's personal opinions rather than the law as it should be established under the rule of law, immigration law for our country. But this whole issue of illegal immigration is compounded and geometrically compounded by the fact that massive illegal drug cartels have gathered on our border. First, remember, and I think all people that have dealt with criminology anywhere, anytime will tell you, when you create a criminal environment, you have to expect that environment to grow. At some point in time in the recent past, the cartels that deliver drugs to basically the entire Western world decided to move their operation from South America up right to the border of the United States, across the border in Mexico. And these cartels have been battling each other in literally warfare to determine what cartels will dominate the illegal importation of drugs and people into this country, and those people brought in many instances for illicit purposes such as prostitution. The most recent count that I have heard is approximately 44,000 Mexicans across the border have lost their life in this war that's going on in Mexico. That is a number that, when you look at the 10 years of warfare our country has been involved in and other places around the world, is astronomical. And to think that that's happening, I live in Round Rock, Texas, which is approximately close to 200 miles from the Mexican border, and to think that there's a war going on in an area where most Texans have, when there was peace upon the border, those Texans visited that area many times during their lifetime because those were our friends across that border. Now they're no longer the friends, they're our enemies. They're not only the enemies of all law-abiding people, but they're enemies of mankind because they are bringing poison into our nation in every form and fashion, and they're killing each other for the right to do so. Now, one of the things that has concerned members of our Texas delegation and members of other delegations in this Congress have been, will that lawlessness spill over into the United States of America? The report that was done by Todd Staples and the Texas Department of Public Safety and others in Texas tells us that not only will it spill over into our country, but it has spilled over into our country, and that there is a evil plan by these cartels to actually come in and try to seize control of every border county in Texas that borders on the Rio Grande. Now that's a big project, and that they are, and actually I would say it is a plan for the invasion of the United States of America. This is something we honestly have to address in a serious manner. We have a lot of legislation pending. One of the bills that I have that connects to this talk today is a bill that will add further assistance to the border sheriffs in their war against the illegal element on the border. our Border Patrol has been grown to an enormous body, and they are involved in this war on the border. Currently, the Texas Rangers have a task force on the border. They are the elite law enforcement officers of Texas, and they have a task force which is working up hopefully a counter plan to stand up to this plan that's coming out of Mexico to start to infiltrate our counties along the border, and ultimately through intimidation, kidnapping, beheading, murdering, and bribing, and all other types of illegal activity, they are going to try to both buy and intimidate their way into a position of control of these counties. Some of these counties have large populations, but some of these counties have very small population and a lot of land mass along the Texas border. And it is a real concern when you're talking about 1,200 miles of border between the United States and Mexico, that someone would have a plan to invade our country and take control of those border counties that are bordering on Mexico. And the first question you would say is, with them fighting to establish their base in Mexico, why would they cross the border? The report that was given, and when I get that report, I'll talk to you about some of the people that were involved in it, but I don't have it in front of me. It was done with the aid of 2 former United States military generals who looked at it from the standpoint of strategic and tactical planning that you would have in the case of any other kind of military invasion, to look at what countermeasures we would take in this country and others. And one of the countermeasures that would fall upon the people of Texas would be that we would need to be using every law enforcement officer we could to their maximum benefit. And therefore, we have done things to enhance border sheriffs in the past. We're going to do things to enhance border sheriffs in the future, but we have a bill that will add to that enhancement. And I would think that's just the tip of the spear of what's going to be needed if these people get serious about trying to come across the border and create criminal counties along the Texas-Mexican border on the Texas side of the border. It's almost beyond our belief, and here's the man with my materials. We'll bring him over here. That's almost beyond our conception of what will truly happen. But this is a copy of the plan. You want to hand one up there to Judge Poe and let him, he's read it, but he might want to have it as a reference. It's Texas Border Security Strategic Military Assessment, prepared in September of 2011, and it some of the funds were provided by Todd Staples, with the Commissioner of the Texas Department of Agriculture. It's assisted by the Texas Department of Public Safety, and 4-star retired General Barry McCaffrey and retired Army Major General Robert Scales, both of which looked at this from a unique and strategic assessment as they would do with a military project. These folks have General McCaffrey is the former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy under President Bill Clinton and the former commander of all U.S. troops in Central and South America. Major General Robert Scales is the former commander of the United States Army War College. These 2 gentlemen have taken the intelligence that has been gathered by the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Border Patrol, the Texas Department of Public Safety special group called the Texas Rangers, and others, to discuss this criminal element on the border. Now, why would we do this today? Well, it's because of what's on this poster right here. We have had an event in our country where these blatant criminals from the cartels have at least been attempted to be, they have been solicited by enemies of our country from Iran to commit a assassination bombing here in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Iran. They tried to hire Mexican cartel members to do this heinous event here to attack the Saudi Arabian and I believe potentially the Israeli embassies here in Washington, D.C. in an attempt to kill those ambassadors from those countries. Now, I have a particular interest in this above the interest I would have anyway, having dealt with law enforcement for many, many years now, in that one of these guys that tried to make the deal has a home in my hometown of Round Rock, Texas. This has just come out recently. I haven't seen what neighborhood it's in yet because I haven't seen it on television, but I'm going to call my son as soon as I get through talking here, and he knows everything that goes on in Round Rock because he's a coach, and he'll know where it is. But it's not, this is serious business when you start realizing that there are people trying to set up assassination plots that live in your hometown. And this is, you know, we are one of the most law-abiding, I would argue we are the most law-abiding county in the state of Texas and one of the most law-abiding counties in the entire nation. And to think that someone would be stupid enough to choose Williamson County as a place for operations for terrorist behavior is almost beyond my belief. But it seems to be, from the indications that are being reported in the news, at least one of these people owned a home in Williamson County. So it shocks me to have to come up here on the floor and admit that about my hometown, but I can promise you if we can find anything we can do to him in Williamson County, we'll take care of the boy. I can give you my assurance of that. But that's another story. But look at these characters and realize we live 200 miles from the Mexican border, and that operations are being planned by people from a foreign country, Iran, an enemy of our nation, part of the axis of evil, as former President Bush talked about. These guys, this criminal element across the border. So that, coupled with this Texas Border Security Act, is a huge eye-opener that this issue that we have talked about now for the entire 10 years I have been, almost 10 years that I've been here in Congress, is a lot more serious issue from a national security standpoint than anything we ever imagined. And I think that's something we really need to start thinking about. I'm joined by another very law and order former judge from the state of Texas, my good friend Ted Poe, and Judge Poe and I both served on the bench. We both did our best to put bad guys where they belonged, and think we did more than our share. And I'll just yield to Congressman Poe whatever time he may wish to consume to discuss this matter.
Thank you, Judge Carter. The reason Williamson County doesn't have any criminals in it, you sent them all to the Texas State Penitentiary when you were judge. But I think this event that has occurred should tell us a lot of things. One, that the country of Iran is so bold that they believe they can commit a crime of terror on the soil of the United States and get away with it. That the United States wouldn't do anything or there wouldn't be any consequences, whatever. But they believe the government, and I believe the government of Iran was in the middle of this, was so arrogant to hurt and kill Americans that they were willing to do this on our homeland. And I think that we have a responsibility to treat this just like had it actually occurred. I mean, had they carried out the assault on the embassy here, killed the ambassador at a restaurant apparently, killed the Israeli ambassador, killed the two ambassadors of the same countries in Argentina, which was discussed, we should be very concerned about that and not give it a pass because our law enforcement did a good job. But also, they're willing to recruit the Zeta cartel to bring explosives into the United States. I wonder whether this is the first time they thought they were dealing with the Zeta cartels. We don't know. But the Zetas to me, are the worst of the worst drug cartels. That reminds me of the old show on television back years ago, Paladin, where he had his card, his business card read, "Have gun, will travel." And that's what the Zetas are. They've got guns and they'll travel anywhere to assassinate people to make a little money. So you got Iran on one side of the world, the drug cartels in Mexico, two criminal enterprises working together, one for political reasons, one for money reasons, to cause harm to the United States. Now, that brings us to a question of the real problem, which is the border. The U.S. border with Mexico and its porousness is a national security issue. It is not an immigration issue. That is a completely different issue. It's a border security, national security issue. Last year, from the, I believe, the same report that you have provided, there were 663 individuals from special interest countries that were captured by our law enforcement. Now, special interest countries, those are countries where terror organizations originate. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan. That's where these 663 people were from that were captured by our law enforcement trying to come into the United States. And they weren't coming over here looking for work that Americans won't do. They were coming over here for mischief reasons. And that's because the border's open. The world knows if you can get to Mexico, you can get to the United States. And that was the plan in this bold endeavor to commit terror in the United States. Recently, he did a border forum in Brownsville where we had primarily law enforcement and people who lived on the border testify about violence on the border. There are some places on the border that aren't violent on the United States side, but there are other places that are. It's not all peaceful and it's not all violent. It depends on the area of the border. And one of the cattle ranchers, one of the cattlemen that's a ranger for the Cattlemen's Association testified that he was so concerned about cross-border travel and crime coming into the United States on ranches, and nothing was being done about the crime that was being committed on these ranches by people crossing into the United States, primarily drug cartels, that the cattlemen, since they don't feel protected, may end up taking the law into their own hands. And we don't want to get into that situation. You mentioned trafficking, human trafficking. That's another tremendous problem that the United States needs to be aware of, that young people, young women, girls from all over the world are being smuggled to Mexico and then smuggled into the United States and then trafficked throughout the United States for sexual crimes. And it's an awful, awful scourge. But they cross the border because it's open in so many places. In our Judiciary Committee a couple of weeks ago, we had testimony that the #1 threat to national security of the United States is not al-Qaeda, but the criminal drug cartels that operate in Mexico. The #1 national security threat are the criminal cartels, drug cartels that operate in Mexico. That should give us really a warning that we really do have a tremendous crisis on our hands, because those people are at war not only with Mexico, but they're at war with the United States. And lastly, I wanted to point out that there are several things that are being done, but the problem still exists. People are crossing into the United States. Border Patrol is doing the best they can. Of course, local law enforcement, the sheriffs, are doing as good a job as they can. And they mentioned the problem that you have talked about how the drug cartels want to infiltrate this side of the border and actually control regions. It's pretty simple what they do. They own land on one side of the Rio Grande River in Mexico, and they want to buy or steal or confiscate land in the Texas side of the Rio Grande River. That way they can move their drugs and smuggling operation from one land they own to another land they own across the river. And when we get in that situation where the drug cartels are owning land on both sides of the border, we've got ourselves a real problem. And it's not just drugs, it's this problem right here. It seems to me that we need more people to protect the security of the United States. That's one of the things the federal government is actually supposed to do, is to protect us. The one piece of legislation I've offered is to put the National Guard on the border, not behind the border, but on the border. 10,000 troops at the request of the governors, supervised by the governors, paid by the federal government, but put them on the border. Right now our policy seems to be, since we can't have enough people on the border, we have them behind the border. And we try to catch them if you can. That's people coming in the United States, everybody, the good and the bad and the ugly. And once we catch them, they become our problem, our financial problem, and then we have to deal with them and try to send as many as we can back. If we have the National Guard on the border, they're not going to cross into the United States if we have that presence. And I think it's come to that where we need to do, actually need to do that and talk about the role of federal government is national security. With that, I'll yield back to my friend.
Reclaiming the time. Thank you, Judge. I also have a bill, and I'm a co-sponsor of your bill. I also believe that we need the National Guard on the border. And, you know, if there is a strategic, as this report indicates, you know, you fight wars tactically and strategically. Strategically are big issue plans. Tactically is how you do the fighting. Well, they seem to have a plan that has been worked out strategically to seize the Texas border, as much of it as they can get, and then tactically how to go about doing this with all sorts of criminal activity until they control some of these very rural, very large rural counties. But I'm sure they're even going to try for some of those urban and quasi-urban counties that are along the border, with the whole intent that it would enhance their ability to move their product. There's an anecdote in this bill that I think you need to, I need to read it. This is what one rancher observed. But the Border Patrol, I can tell you that their hands are tied about a lot of stuff. They have to call Washington. Even if they're having a gunfight down at the river, they're on the phone. They have to call Washington. The Border Patrol have boats on the river. They patrol the river, but they're not allowed to pick up anybody that's in the water unless they are dead. If the drug guys are loading drugs, all they have to do is step out into or wade out into the water, and the Border Patrol can't touch them. They are not allowed to go into the water. They can't do anything about it. Well, if that's the policy of the country and that's what's going on, then they're looking at ways to avoid law enforcement, and this is what this plan goes on to say, on both sides of the border. If the Texas authorities are chasing a carload of drugs in Texas, drive out into the river, and they can't come after you. If the Mexicans are chasing you, then you drive out in the river on the Mexican side. It gives them a getaway to get into that international zone. As long as that's the policy, and I'm not sure the legal ramifications of that. It's always been my understanding that the state of Texas owns to the middle of the river. But there seems to be some policy that says once you're in the water, you can't make an arrest of these people unless you get your hands on them without going into the water. I don't know how you do that. If that's the policy, then that's a getaway zone on both sides of the river. They can run right back in. And if they get this control of law enforcement and other things, which I'm not in any way besmirching these guys that are working nights, weekends, and holidays down there trying to stop this invasion, but, you know, look what they've done to law enforcement across the border. I mean, I think the life expectancy of a chief of police in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, is about 6 hours before they either kill you, behead you, set you on fire, burn up your family, or do something to you. These are evil people, and the Zetas, they're the worst of the gathering of the evil people over there, and they do it for money, and they'll do anything for money, almost anything. Obviously, they didn't do this, but only by the grace of God and good intelligence, and quite honestly, good law enforcement work down there, that we prevent this, and it's almost arguable that we got lucky, because there's so many people they could have contacted that we wouldn't have known about this. It's kind of frightening. Another comment by another person who lives on the border: we see a lot of things, but we keep our mouth shut about it. We just don't want to be on anybody's hit list. I keep to myself. The people that are doing what they're doing, they keep to themselves. If I see something, I ignore it. I look the other way. But there is a problem. It's really bad. Here on the river, you see a lot of stuff and you don't pay attention to it. You walk away and you try to stay in an area where they see you, so if somebody gets caught, they don't say, well, an area where they don't see you. So they say, well, somebody called, and then you try to blend in and not create any waves. This is a citizen. I can tell you that one of our citizens owns land on the border, and he's told stories of armed, 50 caliber machine gun armed, mounted Toyota pickups. I don't mean to besmirch Toyota, but that's what they are. Drive on loaded up with cartel members telling deer hunters to get off the ranch because they're hunting there that day, which means they're bringing a big load of drugs across the river. There's anecdote after anecdote from the citizens of Texas who talk about, one of the things I think is very important that we explain to people and everybody that might be paying attention to this. There's one very difference between Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And that is, in Texas, we retained our public lands when we came into the United States under treaty. So the land that they cross the river onto is not federal land. It's individual human beings' land. The people water their cattle in the Rio Grande off of their ranch, and that Rio Grande is one border of their ranch. They own the land right up to the river, which is different in Arizona. It's different in California. In most instances, they butt up against federally owned land, because in the other states, all land not owned by the individuals is owned by the federal government as part of federal lands. But in our state, our land, we have no federal lands. We have only state-owned lands and lands owned by individuals. So it's actually a state-owned land or it's individual land, with the exception of the Big Bend National Park. It's the only exception that we have.
Will the gentleman yield for a comment?
I will yield.